Professor Palmater from Toronto, Canada. Please.
Kwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation on unceded Mi'kmaqi territory in what is now known as Canada. And I want to say what an honor it is to have been invited here by the chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Panzeri, and also to the president for hosting me. It is indeed an incredible honor, and I thank you for going outside of your comfort zone and lifting up the voice of an Indigenous woman to share my perspective on the importance of human rights and in a global context. Sometimes we focus so much on progress that's been made and celebrate all of the laws and policies, which are things to celebrate, that it puts us in a place of comfort. And sometimes we relax when we're in that place of comfort, and that makes us slip a little bit backwards and be less vigilant about what is happening to people in countries all around the world. And there's a natural human tendency, of course, to want to hear the good and sometimes be a bit willfully blind to the things that are very difficult. But we have to understand that the messages of human rights defenders around the world, and especially Indigenous peoples, isn't just to governments. It's not just to organizations, and it's not just to convince the naysayers to come over to our side. There's another aspect to these messages, and that is to inform, empower, and mobilize Indigenous peoples to take the lead in Indigenous human rights defense and to make a difference on an ongoing basis so that our communities have hope. Because when our communities don't have hope, that's when you see things like high levels of suicide. I also think that it's important for very developed countries to be brave enough to use themselves as examples, not just celebrate the things that you believe you're doing right, but to be brave enough to highlight the things that aren't going so well. And that's why I'm going to use Canada as an example, because Canada, as we know, is one of the largest and wealthiest countries in the world. In every international forum, it praises itself for its commitment to multiculturalism, diversity, gender equality. We have human rights laws in every province, a national human rights framework. We participate in all of the UN treaty bodies. And of course, our own Constitution has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that's committed to things like life, liberty, freedom of the press, and rather uniquely, a commitment to protecting Aboriginal and treaty rights and land rights of Indigenous peoples. It's ranked by business analysts as the top 5 countries to live, and the United Nations Human Development Index always puts it somewhere near the top 10. That's pretty incredible. That's a place that would naturally draw people to want to live there. But when you isolate the conditions of Indigenous peoples in Canada, then the UN Human Development Index for Canada drops from the top 10 down into 48th place, 57th place, 63rd place after countries like Chile and Argentina. And it shows you that there's a dramatic contradiction in our country. So much so that the former Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples said that Canada is itself this incredible contradiction in terms. It is a champion and defender of human rights. It has incredible protections for Indigenous peoples, yet it has committed violations under every single human rights protection. Today, there isn't a single human rights protection in Canada that isn't currently being violated by Canada with regards to Indigenous peoples. So sometimes we have to be very specific and look at the conditions of very specific groups. I mean, Indigenous peoples only make up 5% of the population in Canada, but more than 20% don't have access to clean drinking water in a country that's exceptionally wealthy. 40% of all homeless people in Canada are Indigenous, but if you look at specific provinces, it's as high as 90%. We have a massive health crisis, not just the one that occurred over the last few years, but over many decades. We suffer the highest rates of chronic illnesses and diseases, the highest rates of accidents, and the #1 cause of death for our youth is suicides. Canada's First Nations have the highest suicide rates in the world and have held that record for 25 years, including war-torn countries. How can that be, and how many people know about that? For women and children, it's much worse. More than 60% of Indigenous families live in poverty. Children live in poverty. The overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in prison is a crisis that keeps getting worse and worse and worse. The fastest growing prison population in our country is actually little Indigenous girls. In some institutions, 98% of all of their inmates are Indigenous girls. In a year, it'll be 100%. So while crime and arrests are going down for the rest of the population and Canada looks like it's moving ahead, it isn't for Indigenous peoples. What about the rate of murdered and missing and disappeared women in Canada? There's more than 4,000. I mean, the whole concept of disappeared Indigenous women isn't something that anyone would ever have associated with Canada. We're the #1 targets of human traffickers. More than 40% of our Indigenous women, little girls, and babies are kidnapped and trafficked by human traffickers for one reason and one reason only: complete impunity. There are no consequences in our society for violence against Indigenous women. It's almost 100% impunity rate. And thank goodness for human rights champions like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others who have stood beside us to advocate and to bring this to the world's attention. And if we didn't have international mechanisms, our voices would be falling on deaf ears. We have tried for many decades to get Canada to take action, but it's only because of the intervention of the, the IACHR, the CEDAW committee, the human rights committees, all of these treaty bodies who give us an opportunity and a voice to say, here's what's happening. Can you make some recommendations? Can you work with Canada to encourage them to change this? And that's why I think that global human rights mechanisms are needed, because it's a humanitarian crisis. And while many people think that this is just part of Canada's colonial legacy, that it's somehow in the history books, it's actually linked today. The very same things that they did in the past, forced sterilizations and the theft of our children, are ongoing today. Our women and girls are still being sterilized. These are the kinds of problems that developed countries thought were closed off a long time ago. And I have several positive examples. I know there are lots of critics of the UN or other treaty right mechanisms and human right mechanisms because they don't have an enforcement mechanism. They don't come with their own army to make sure that countries fulfill these recommendations. But if you look at our Sandra Lovelace case in the 1970s, when Canada refused to amend the Indian Act to end gender discrimination against Indigenous women and wouldn't hear any of our cases, the UN did, and they said that this is a gross violation on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and it was enough of a political embarrassment to force Canada to amend the law. It didn't end all gender discrimination, but it ended a good deal of it. That never would have come about had an international body not looked at it independently and objectively and said, you can't do this to Indigenous people. Similarly, for decades, we have been trying to get Canada to engage in a national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. As the numbers kept growing, the only places where we found solidarity were with Indigenous women in Mexico and Indigenous women in the United States who weren't getting action either. The Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the IACHR, and other human rights bodies said this is a grave violation of the core human rights of Indigenous women and girls in Canada. In Canada, we recommend that you do an inquiry. And they didn't do one right away. But report after report after report helped us build momentum and pressure to have Canada finally have a national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is ongoing right now. We never would have gotten that without these independent international mechanisms that give us a voice. And so that's why I would like to make a call to all of you and all of the European Union to be very concerned about human rights violations that happen in other countries, and not just countries that are in the news, but especially those that aren't in the news, your allies and partners, because while you might think that violations in Canada don't concern you, I would argue that they do. Humanity and human dignity is a global concept, and we live in a global family. And I'm sure, like most of your families, we are held accountable as individuals. We might not like it when our parents or our grandparents or our aunts and uncles hold us accountable, but nevertheless, we must be held accountable. And I think in this global family, other countries have to hold other countries accountable for the things that they're doing, because they all benefit from this. Keep in mind international trade agreements where Canada violates the rights of Indigenous peoples in order to have goods and services for international trade agreements. That might benefit you, but it's causing death and destruction and other things in Indigenous communities. So never let Canada or the United States or any other country tell you to mind your own business. Humanity and human dignity and life is all of our business. And I believe that together we can do this. It's not the number of laws you have that says whether or not you're a champion of human rights. It's how well you implement them and make sure that people have the protection of them. It's not the long list of government programs and services that you have. It's the actual impact on the people who are receiving those services. So I think that we should all be governing in our global community based on a human rights framework and not succumb to the view that human rights should be a popularity contest. It's about core human dignity, and if it erodes for one, it'll erode for all. Thank you.